been a while, has it not? Yes, it has. Thank you for asking. Where have I been? Another great question. Ugh. Look at this. Look at this massive monster of a book. Look at this thing. It's thicker than my brain. Yeah, so this is Alan Moore's Jerusalem. It came out just last month. I actually ordered it way back in January. Can you believe it? It's because I'm a pretty big Alan Moore admirer. He hasn't written a lot of prose. I mean, he has written a fair amount of prose. He wrote another novel, Voice of the Fire, and he's written pieces here and there, but what people mostly know him as is a comic book writer. I've been reading him for at least 20-something years because I know in 1993, 1963, a comic came out that he wrote that I remember getting that as it came out, and I think maybe even earlier than that, maybe Batman the Killing Joke, or maybe his Spawn work. I don't know, like something like that may have been my first exposure to him. I know that by 1996, when I went to Comic-Con in San Diego, I went to a panel with Dave Gibbons, so I know at that point I had read Watchmen at least. And I've read pretty much all of his major works and a lot of his minor works as well, and he's been one of the most influential authors in my reading life. So it's hard to like just ignore when he puts out a massive book like this. So I was pretty excited about getting this, also because I had read his other novel, Voice of the Fire, twice actually, and I liked it more the first time, but I still appreciate it a lot, and it's still a pretty impressive work. So what is this one about? That's a good question. Thank you for also asking. Much like Voice of the Fire and maybe also Big Numbers, a series that he started, this really is about the town that he's lived in all his life, Northampton, England. He unearths a lot of the history that has happened there and that kind of springs from this. He really kind of stretches the influence of the town, I think, but still he makes it kind of have a convincing argument. And maybe he's not always convinced, but his characters can sometimes be convinced. Like, for example, he has one character that researches kind of this literary figure, and he kind of traces that to kind of the birth of Gothic fiction, mystery fiction, science fiction, all that coming from this one author in Northampton, which is probably a stretch, but still it's an interesting thesis that the character puts forth. So what's it all about, A? It's divided into 3 sections, and the first section and the third section I enjoyed more than the second section. And so those 2 sections are kind of told in each chapter. Each has 11 chapters, and each chapter is kind of from a different perspective, a different era in history, and I kind of liked how it jumped around. It's very similar to Voice of the Fire, except not as linear, because Voice of the Fire begins in the far past and brings it up to the present, but this can jump around centuries or years, or there's also this kind of connection between the characters. A lot of them are related. There's kind of like a family kind of line, similar to, I was thinking of William Faulkner, who I admire a lot, and Moore kind of brings that to the table, and that we may see a piece of one family's life, and then like 20 to 30 years earlier, another character who was maybe a minor character becomes a major character, and that's kind of cool to be able to link all that together if you can handle it. And for the most part, he does in those sections. There's also this kind of overarching art exhibit that's going on with this artist character she's a woman, but you can kind of tell she's a stand-in for Alan Moore. A lot of her behavior and her actions are very similar to, you can tell it's kind of him in another alter ego. And I like the two books well enough. The problem that I had with the book was the middle section, especially. So the middle section is not told in this jump around manner. It's told more or less in a straight progression of events, but it's the most fantasy laden section of the book. There's all this, it's basically like this kind of a parallel dimension upon the town that's kind of outside of time, and which characters are kind of dead, and there's like these kind of, not gods, but kind of, they're called the builders, that are these forces behind history and everything that is going on. And I wanted to like this section, but it became painful. It starts to read like the worst Harry Potter, the worst Neil Gaiman. Book 2 also reminded me of Prometheus, another series by Moore that don't get me wrong, Prometheus has beautiful, beautiful art by J.H. Williams III, but the story, it starts out as a story and it somehow turns into this really tedious explanation of Hermetic Kabbalah and the tarot that kind of, it's interesting. It's a good handbook to learn those, the tarot and Kabbalah, but it's not really a story at that point. It just starts to become this really rote walkthrough of these things that I just did not enjoy. So book 2 of this is very similar to that kind of tone. It's melodramatic, and I get it that Moore was parodying kind of children's literature from, say, like 100 years ago and that kind of thing, but it just doesn't interest me the way that he tells it. It's pretty painful, I thought. The whole effect of the book reminds me of 2 things. It reminded me of 2 books specifically, and there's more than that. There's references to other books and kind of homages and parodies that kind of Moore is known for. That's kind of his thing, and he often does it quite well, but I just sometimes wish he wouldn't do it and just tell a story like he can do. And but anyways, Ulysses by James Joyce, this reminds me a lot of that in the sense that he takes the town and really maps it out street by street, and characters go, you could follow the characters on a map or go in person and walk the paths that they took. More clearly gives enough indications of where they're at. He's always referencing streets, there's maps in the book, so you can do that, but it's just like, does it add to the book's story? And I think a lot of it is no. Unlike Ulysses, I don't really want to go back and read this again, and I don't want to have that level of familiarity with it. Ulysses, it feels like there's more that I'm going to be able to discover, and that the closer I get to it, it actually helps the story. But this, it just feels like it wouldn't help the story. It would just make it more. It also made me think of Against the Day, the book by Thomas Pynchon, also quite a paperweight, that is really a great book. I love it. It's one of my 3 favorite Pynchon novels, along with Gravity's Rainbow and Mason and Dixon. And this Jerusalem, I think Moore started shortly after Against the Day was released, so maybe that was kind of a motivation to like get him doing a novel. The scope that Pynchon covers in that book, the way that he kind of parodies children's fiction. But I don't know, I like Against the Day a lot, and a lot of this I just didn't like. It does have great writing. There's like maybe 200 pages, 300 pages of really great writing, great moments, just really narrative innovations that I admired a lot, and I'm really glad I read. But do you really want to sift through 500 pages of bad writing and another 500 pages of pretty good, sometimes okay writing, but to get to those 200, 300 pages, yeah, it's really up to you. I think some other people have commented, and like the book feels just very bloated. It's like too much, and it could have probably used an editor. And there's an art exhibition in the book, and that kind of is more speaking to the book itself. The art exhibition is the book, in the sense that he just doesn't care if people like it or not. He's just like, I didn't do it for you, I did it for me. And that's great, but you're the one reading it, so it's your time. Do you want to waste or spend 1,200 pages reading this? And I wouldn't recommend it as your first initiation into Alan Moore. My all-time favorite Alan Moore stories, let me tell you. So Watchmen, of course, you should read. It's pretty dark, but it's really good, and you should know it because it's like the thing that he's most well known for. A lot of his other books that people like Swamp Thing, I don't really care for. V for Vendetta, it's okay. Lost Girls, I don't really care for. It's the things that I like most are kind of his humorous books, and kind of the books that are about science fiction and in a way that's optimistic. So I mentioned 1963. I actually love 1963. It's a great kind of homage to Marvel Comics in the 1960s. I also love his run on his Superman stories, the one he did with Dave Gibbons. I believe it's called For the Man Who Has Everything. And the one he did with Kurt Swan that I love a lot is Whatever Happened to the Man of Tomorrow. Both of those stories are just amazing. I also like his run on Supreme, which is also a Superman parody, but very well done. Let's see. I love the first two volumes of The League of Extraordinary Gentlemen. They also have that kind of dark humor that I like that he doesn't always use in this book. He has this kind of really dark tone that he uses a lot that is just really acidic and just bitter in some cases, and I can only take so much of that. So when he has humor, there's one great chapter in this book where it's like this this out of work actor who imagines he's a hard-boiled detective, and I thought it was pretty funny. It has a lot of really good humor. That's what I like most about Moore. But I do appreciate his versatility. It's just like 1,200 pages of this that not all of it's that good. So, and like I said, Voice of the Fire, his other novel, is a lot shorter and pretty great. It's like maybe 300 something pages, I think, and that doesn't have the bloat of this. That feels much more. It also doesn't have the talking down to the readers, I think. It doesn't explain everything. It just points out different events, and it kind of forces you to put them together. So that book, I would say, is a better place if you do want to try his prose rather than his comics for some reason. Oh, and I didn't mention one of my all-time favorite comics by him, Tomorrow's Stories, which is largely influenced by Mad Magazine, that level of humor. And that's the energy that I love from him, when he's just like off the wall, exuberant, and just full-blown wild and crazy. Whereas this is just, a lot of this is depressing and blah, blah, blah. So Jerusalem, a nice skeleton, just not fleshed out, or maybe too fleshed out, too overindulgent, too much. There's one chapter that is based or kind of stylized after Finnegan's Wake, the great book by James Joyce that is written in this kind of mash blot of language. That's because James Joyce was such a linguist. He spoke many languages, and he just kind of combined them all into this super language in Finnegan's Wake that everything's mutating and constantly in motion. And I love the challenge of that book, but when Moore does it, it doesn't have the musicality of Joyce, and it doesn't have the linguistic verisimilitude, whatever I'm trying to say. Like, it doesn't have quite as much growth to it. It just feels more boring. Yeah, that was a tough chapter to get through. I did make it through, though. It's very slow going, and as with a lot of it, I didn't feel the reward was worth the attempt. So, I mean, like I said, I do applaud his attempt and his audacity at trying to make this massive organism of a book, and it does have some crazy, wonderful narrative, postmodern techniques that are just unheard of, that I've never seen done quite in this way. But it's just you have to slough through so much to get to it. The book is really about eternalism, which is this philosophical concept that everything is already finished, and time and space are just all finished and complete, and it has to do with fatalism and whether we can change anything or whether everything's already written. And Moore definitely subscribes to it, but I like it, and I like that he paints it so clearly, but I just would have liked kind of maybe a little counter argument or a little uncertainty about other possibilities for how time exists and what its possibilities are. Because yeah, it's as a tract on eternalism, he probably gives his most detailed accounts of it, but I kind of preferred when he includes it, for example, in Watchmen, in the perspective of Dr. Manhattan. And it's been done in other books too, like, Slaughterhouse-Five is one of the greatest novels that I think is one of the best novels ever written, that really documents eternalism in a way that Moore does pretty good in Watchmen. And it's just here, it's like I said, too much. It's like, okay, we get it. I would have rather seen it at the periphery, at the edge of things, rather than right in your face over and over and over. So if you really, really love Moore, go check out this book. But if not, I would not recommend this as a starting place or even maybe a finishing place.